Our gospel lesson is found in the Gospel according to Mark. We are in the 8th chapter and we'll be beginning with the 27th verse. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea and Philippi, and on the way he asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others Elijah, and still others one of the prophets." He asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said all this quite openly. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to them, "If anyone want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will it profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." May God bless the reading and hearing of this word. May God bless our understanding of it. I invite you to pray with me. We are grateful for this ancient word, all the while asking that it might be given new life as we encounter it on this day. Let us hear a word that is to us and for us. These are our prayers. And now may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable unto you. Amen. This past week, on September 11th, we observed that anniversary that has been rolling around now for 23 years. It's hard to believe that it has been that long since the attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. It is that sort of event of such historical significance that we tend to remember where we were and what we were doing when it happened. I would imagine you have your own stories about that. I was, for my part, playing golf with a group of pastors. We made the turn and went into the clubhouse shortly after the second plane hit the World Trade Center, and the awareness settled in upon us that what we were witnessing was not an accident. We were so dazed that we actually started the back nine. About 2 holes in, I said to my playing partners, "I'm not supposed to be here. I'm not sure where I'm supposed to be, but it's not here." They agreed, and we all left the course. I went to my office, turned on a TV to continue following the events, fielded a few phone calls from troubled and shocked parishioners, and then, when the time came, went to pick up the children from school. The following Sunday, all across the land, churches were full of people looking for answers, even though most of what we had were just a lot of questions. How could this happen? How could an act of terrorism of this magnitude happen here on American soil? And why? What was the animosity behind it? How should we respond? What would it mean for our children who were growing up in the world? These were large questions. Some of them, ultimately, we may have answered. Some of them we're still asking until this day. I don't know that today's gospel lesson answers any of those questions. But what it does do is allow us to witness the posing of some big questions, perhaps as big or bigger than those questions that we were asking after those September 11th attacks. Who do the people say that I am? Jesus asked. Now, there's a lot to that question. What is the religious establishment saying about me? Do they love me? Or am I getting on their nerves? And what is the word on the street? Are the common people curious? Are they waiting on a revolution? And then what about the Romans? Do they see me as a threat? Have they noticed me? Who do the people say that I am? And the disciples readily answered. Some say John the Baptist or Elijah or one of the prophets. Well, it's hard to say what Jesus thought about those answers because he immediately pivoted to another question. What about you? Who am I to you? Now, before I utter another syllable aimed at answering that question, I want to let you know that I have less to say about who Jesus was and is than I have to say about where we might find Jesus. Despite that, it is at this point that I am required by my standing as an ordained minister to ask you, who do you say that Jesus is? Everybody has an opinion, and we have been articulating those opinions for 2,000 years. Church folk have an opinion. I bet you've got one. The barber has an opinion. The pizza delivery guy has an opinion. Lots of opinions. I've discovered, as because of my vocation, a lot of people share their opinions of who Jesus is with me. And sometimes they'll invite me to share who I believe Jesus to be, and we'll have a nice conversation. And then there are other conversations. The most problematic ones, however, are the ones that I have with people who are absolutely, positively certain of just who Jesus is. So certain that they assume that their Jesus is my Jesus. And all the while I'm sitting there nodding my head, but thinking, no, I don't know that Jesus. I've heard of that Jesus you're describing, but I don't know him. Now, I'd like to tell you that in these situations, I'm so bold that I help them to see the light of who I know Jesus to be. But I'm not that bold. I just smile and start looking for an exit strategy to get out of the conversation. But let's not let all that distract us from the seriousness of the question, and it is a serious question. And as it is with most important questions, we probably are wise not to be looking for the easy answer. We should be looking for an answer that might trouble us a little bit. We should be looking for an answer, most of all, to hard questions, I believe, that requires something of us. So, Jerry Maguire, one of those movies that I like and have seen hundreds of times, and yet when I'm channel surfing, I'll stop there and watch at least a little bit of it. I watch it at least till that scene where they talk about completing one another and those sorts of things. In the movie, played by Tom Cruise, Jerry Maguire is a once successful sports agent whose life is unraveling quickly, in large part because he had developed a conscience which didn't seem to fit well with his vocation of being a sports agent. The movie finds him losing all of his clients, all of them except one, a football player named Rod Tidwell, who's played fantastically by Cuba Gooding Jr. He sticks with Jerry Maguire even while all of his other clients are leaving. Rod Tidwell becomes his last client. He's loyal to Jerry Maguire, but he's a problematic guy. and not always very easy to get along with. In my favorite scene from the movie, it happens in a locker room. Jerry is at his wit's end and trying to deal with this guy, and he's losing it. And by it, I mean the last scrap of his sanity. Rod Tidwell says to him in response to his erratic behavior, "Man, you are hanging by a very thin thread. And I dig that about you." I'll admit something that I'm a lot like Rod Tidwell. I dig people hanging by thin threads. The strange, the different, those with a little tread worn off their tires. You know who I like in these words, who I dig? I dig people with a story, who aren't afraid to tell that story, even of the parts which include some bumps in the road. I like people with a story. Yes, I dig those sorts of people. And maybe they have something to say to us about who Jesus is. Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" This is the same Jesus who announced quite plainly that if we want to find him, truly encounter him, that we're going to be surprised about where it happens. This is the same Jesus who said that whatever you have done to the least of these, you have done to me. Jesus calls it the least of these. I call it those who are hanging by a very thin thread. Every now and then, I feel the need to remind you and me of Kim Davis. Do you remember Kim Davis? If it doesn't ring a bell, if I had asked you that question in 2015, you would know exactly who she was because she was on every TV set, on the front of every newspaper. Landmark decisions had paved the way for same-sex couples to be married. And folks like us rejoiced. It's a wonderful time. But not everybody was rejoicing, and Kim Davis was among those not rejoicing. But she had a unique position to express her unhappiness with the court's decisions because of her position. She was the county clerk from Rowan County, Kentucky, who was so opposed to same-sex unions that she refused, despite the court's orders, to issue those licenses. I remember being involved in a small protest at Alamance County because there were some insinuations that the same thing might happen there. Her 15 minutes of fame led to court cases and eventually to her own arrest for contempt of court. She described her actions, and I quote, as coming under the authority of God. Now, you are a smart congregation, and that is one of the things that I really love about you, and so I don't want to sound patronizing when I give you advice, but I'm going to give you some advice. If anybody ever tells you that the thing that they are doing is under the authority of God, run. Even if you don't run very fast anymore, run as fast as you can. In the course of her protest, though, a spotlight was placed on her own life, and it revealed a number of divorces and broken relationships, tragically broken relationships with her family. And this, given the stand that she had taken, made her a source of mockery for some. Now, she was applauded by some as a person with the courage of convictions. She was lambasted by others, including this preacher, for the stand that she was taking. I did not like Kim Davis. And I had that energy that not liking somebody sort of gives us and makes us feel a little righteous ourselves. Comedian Kevin Hart summed it up for me when some of her supporters compared her to Rosa Parks whose actions ignited the civil rights movement. And Kevin Hart said, she wasn't Rosa Parks, she was the bus driver who did his best to keep Rosa Parks in the back of the bus. Well, like I said, it felt good to dislike Kim Davis. It felt really good. She stood for everything that I stood against. But one day it hit me. I was watching her on the news, and this was after all of the revelations had been made about the brokenness of her own life. One day it hit me. I saw something in her eyes. It was underneath all the anger and the vitriol. There she stood, one of the least of these. One of the very people in whom Jesus insisted that if I wanted to know him and encounter him, this is where I would encounter him. I could see it plainly. This was a human being who was hanging by a very, very thin thread. I don't know how she came to be who she was. But perhaps somewhere when her heart was hungry or vulnerable, recovering from one of those broken relationships which were revealed for all of the world to see, she was taught the worst lesson that religion can teach us. The worst lesson which religion can teach us isn't to hate, although that's bad enough. The worst lesson that religion can teach us isn't intolerance or bigotry, although that is bad enough. Of all the things that we rail against and that I rail against behind this pulpit, and things that we should rail against, the most dastardly lesson which religion can teach us is fear. Once I looked again at Kim Davis, I understood that I'd just missed it. I knew the lesson that she had learned. I know the enemy of her soul because it is also the enemy of my soul. She had learned to fear life, to fear love, which had proved so painful for her, to fear God, to fear others. And that's it. That is the enemy of our souls. That is the enemy which assaults our unity as churches, as communities, as a nation, as a human race, when we fear one another. Scripture implores us not to fear over and again, and yet some way Kim Davis and others, and sometimes the others are us, learn to fear, to live not with joy and love as our grounding, but to live out of fear. The enemy attacks us when we begin to fear that without our Sunday best, without our pretenses, without our false selves, without our airs, that if we were to be seen, we would be abandoned by everyone, including God. I wish that everybody had at least one person. I mean, unconditional love is a tough thing, and I don't even know, well, how possible it is sometimes. But I wish everybody had one person who loved them as close to unconditionally as is humanly possible. And if you have that person, be thankful. I wish everybody had that one person that at least gave us some tiny glimpse into the unconditional nature of God's love for us. But once we learn to fear, and this devilish lie wraps its tentacles around our hearts, and fear has run our course, we find ourselves not just afraid of the truth about ourselves, but we too can also become afraid of God, afraid of one another. Once we become afraid of one another, we see the tragedy play out again And again, when human beings begin to fear one another, we strike out and belittle. We bruise and we break one another. And when fear has run its full course in the hearts of women and men, we try to eliminate those that we fear. In 2006, I took my youngest son, Mitchell, to his first ever Georgia Bulldog football game. It was at the Georgia Dome in Atlanta. We won, by the way. That is only a small part of the story. He was 12. The game was a back and forth, very exciting finish. And when the game was over, people were excited and there was a buzz in the air. We had ridden the MARTA train to the game. MARTA is the public transportation system which exists in Atlanta. We had ridden that to the stadium. And after the game ended, we went back to that station and we prepared to board a train. And we're waiting on the people in front of us to board that train. And as it turned out, the train filled up just as we were the last ones preparing to board. And so we waited behind that yellow line where we were instructed to wait, with just a few feet between us and the track. And for just a matter of seconds, I could feel that distracted and excited crowd of hundreds of people pushing forward without even realizing it. I had this rush of fear, and I grabbed Mitchell around his shoulders and began to push back against the crowd. And the person behind me had sensed the same thing and began to help. All the while we're doing this, I'm aware that if the crowd really surged forward, there would be nothing that we could do to deal with it. Thankfully, though, no sooner than the panic/fear had set in, the crowd settled a little bit and the next train came in and we boarded. But when we sat down, my hands were trembling. And to this day, almost 2 decades later, I can sometimes feel the weight of that crowd. Now, I know that that is a different kind of fear. That was a warranted sort of fear. But still, it prompts me to think about the weight of the powerful forces pressing against human beings. These forces which can press against us, pushing us toward the darkness of fear. If we are to be saved from those forces, it will come not through discovering the one right answer to the question proposed by our gospel text. It will come if we just stay in the journey. Stay in that process of growing and becoming. Stay in that question until the answer someday arrives upon us. It will come if we discover who Jesus is and how he can be encountered in the least of these and in all of those hanging by a thin thread. Yes, one day I looked again at Kim Davis and realized that she was my sister. We had so little in common, I never wanted to admit it to myself.